Have you ever secretly made a resolution at some point not to become like your parents? Ellen looked at her mother, who was over 40 but dressed like Dorothy, feeling very embarrassed for her. Sometimes she even wondered why her talented father, a university professor, chose her mother, a mundane housewife. Her mother spent her days working in the kitchen, worrying about little things, even refusing to throw away broken shards of a plate. She said she could use the shards to decorate the table. Compared to her ordinary and tacky mother, her father, a professor in the literature department, seemed much more dignified. He would discuss literature and art with Ellen, give her writing tips, and tell her she was very talented. But that wasn't enough. She had to reach to excel. Remembering her father's words, Ellen stayed in New York after graduating from Harvard and became an editor at a magazine. She considered herself extraordinary, longing to showcase her talents and become as outstanding as her father. This time, she came home rarely because it was her father's birthday. Seeing the affection between her parents, Ellen felt that her mother was not worthy of her father. But as a daughter, she felt comforted to see them together. However, the next day, a bad news shattered the warmth household. Her mother, who had been feeling unwell, went to the doctor and was diagnosed with a terminal illness. Her father asked Ellen, the eldest daughter, to resign from her job in New York and move back home to take care of her mother. Ellen couldn't believe it. Her job in New York had been her dream. Her father didn't even consult with her, he just gave her a command. She tried to persuade her father to take a break, reminding him of the long sabbatical he took a few years ago to write a novel. But her suggestion was flatly rejected. Her father insisted that he was the pillar of the family and the school couldn't do without him. Although Ellen suggested hiring a caregiver to look after her mother, her father criticized her for studying in vain and not even willing to care for her mother herself. Under her father's insistence, Ellen reluctantly returned to her company to request an extended leave of absence. This was undoubtedly a huge blow to her, as she was in a rising period in her career. Ellen begged desperately and managed to retain only one project. So, she gave up her job in New York and her long-lasting boyfriend to return home reluctantly. When her mother saw her, she was pleasantly surprised and asked if Ellen was just coming home for the weekend. Ellen said she would be staying for a while, and her mother immediately understood the reason behind her return. Feeling some self-reproach, her mother murmured that Ellen shouldn't have come back. It looks like her father had made the decision for her to look after her mother alone. To protect her father, she lied and said she had come back voluntarily. It seemed like a way to make it up to Ellen. One evening, her father pulled out a stack of thick manuscripts and asked her if she could write a foreword for his new book. Ellen was delighted, thinking her abilities had been recognized by her father. She embraced the manuscripts eagerly, but her father casually added a pile of clothes to the stack and asked her to wash them, dictating specific instructions. Ellen froze in place, realizing that the tasks that once belonged to her mother were now her responsibility. She had never imagined how challenging simple tasks would be in her hands. Grilled chicken turned into charcoal, chocolate cakes became a mess, and she couldn't even fold napkins correctly. Besides handling the household meals, Ellen also had to accompany her mother to a company friend's home after gatherings. She really didn't understand why her mother went to such great lengths every week to host parties at home and tirelessly drove friends home for hours. Discontentedly, she asked her mother why she wasted so much time doing these things. Her mother slowly revealed the truth, saying that the friend had been feeling down since her divorce and used to stay at home for a long time, refusing to go out. So one of them came up with an idea, which was to take turns hosting, taking the friend out to have fun, improving her mood, and making sure the friend didn't feel so lonely. Ellen kept silent, rare for her, and saw a glint of admiration in her mother. As the weeks passed by, Ellen found her mother was doing okay by herself and it increasingly difficult to tolerate the mundane life at home, so she contemplated proposing to return to New York to her father. However, when she arrived at the school, she found that the office was empty. She had to sit outside and wait. Coincidentally, she overheard the students chatting. They mentioned that their father seemed to be involved with a new female teaching assistant and even brought up the fact that their father always seemed to verbally harass female students. He would say to each female student, "You have real talent, but you must reach." The father had also said the same thing to Ellen. Ellen listened with a mixture of fear and apprehension as the perfect image of her father in her mind seemed to be starting to shatter. And her mother's illness worsened suddenly without warning. She lay in bed drenched in sweat, her face pale from the intense pain. Despite this, she insisted that her father go to work. The father was at a loss, unable to even locate a heating blanket. It was Ellen who found one and laid it over her mother. The family doctor arrived to examine her mother and promptly decided to send a nurse to monitor her condition. Ellen protested, insisting that she could take care of her mother. However, the doctor insisted that her mother needed someone she could be open with about her condition. Ellen believed her mother could confide in her about any issues. But under the doctor's persistence, the nurse still came to the house. The hired caregiver was evidently more experienced than Ellen, carefully noting her mother's symptoms and asking many details that Ellen had never paid attention to, such as whether her mother struggled to dress or get out of the bathtub. Her mother's answers made Ellen realize that her mother had many difficulties that she had not told her about, often enduring everything on her own. A sense of guilt swept over Ellen. One evening, to everyone's surprise, the father came home early and brought the restaurant's band with him. He arranged a candlelit dinner for the mother. Watching the affectionate scene between her parents, Ellen couldn't shake off a strange feeling in her heart. In the coming days, Ellen started accompanying her mother to various gatherings and amusement parks. What she once thought was a dull and uninteresting life had now become precious because of her mother's company. After the party ended, the father still didn't come home. To ensure he didn't miss the Halloween candy distribution event he loved, the mother urged Ellen to go to school and fetch him. Unable to find anyone in the office, Ellen turned around only to see her father walking intimately with a strange woman. Despite having heard some rumors before, witnessing this scene with her own eyes was still difficult for her to accept. Returning home and seeing her mother lying on the sofa, Ellen didn't want to upset her, so she lied about her father still being at class. Feeling despondent, she went upstairs, unaware that her mother had noticed her expression and sighed helplessly. As Christmas approached, which should have been a time for family reunion, the father, without consulting the family, brought home a famous writer. Ellen was left busy preparing meals. Before dinner, when the mother thanked Ellen for her efforts in entertaining guests and managing everything, the father remained silent about Ellen's contributions. Instead, he praised the famous writer, claiming the writer had inspired him to write his own novel. However, the writer mistakenly believed the father's novel was about some sort of investment project, leading to an awkward situation. Ellen's perfect image of her father collapsed completely. Feeling frustrated, she sought solace at a bar and poured out her grievances to her boyfriend, who remained silent and flirted with others. Ellen couldn't bear it anymore and had a meltdown at the bar before returning home. The mother sensed her daughter's despondency and gently suggested that it was time for Ellen to return to New York, as that was where Ellen truly belonged. Ellen couldn't understand why her mother was silently enduring everything and found it even harder to accept her father's disloyalty and cowardice. Coincidentally, the scandalous politician whom Ellen was supposed to interview was released from prison. She immediately rushed to New York and staked out outside the hotel, eventually spotting the target. Using her status as a Harvard alumna, she got close to him and found an excuse to get into his car. This was a rare opportunity for an interview, but when she heard the politician express his feelings of defeat, Ellen couldn't help but be lost in thought. The politician mentioned that at some point, his life had become a mess. Despite constant efforts to move forward, he felt lost somewhere along the way. All he could do now was try his best to make up for his wife and children. Witnessing the politician's genuine emotions, Ellen was reminded of a childhood trip where her mother sat in the front seat, gently knitting a sweater with her skillful fingers, seeming to possess a magical touch. When did life turn into a disaster? That night, after much hesitation, Ellen decided to call her supervisor and said that she hadn't managed to interview the politician. She realized she couldn't exploit others' pain for her work anymore. Although this decision meant all her efforts were in vain and she might lose her job, Ellen didn't regret it. What mattered most to her now was being by her mother's side. Feeling Ellen's recent hostility, the father invited her out and Ellen unleashed all her built-up dissatisfaction, questioning him why her mother hadn't sought treatment earlier, why his work was so important, and why their family had fallen apart, yet he pretended everything was fine. The father nervously hushed her, fearing judgmental looks from others. Ellen's disappointment in her father reached its peak. In the following days, she accompanied her mother to more gatherings where her mother sat in a wheelchair surrounded by a crowd, though her condition had deteriorated beyond treatment. The doctor prescribed the strongest pain relief medication, warning to be cautious of overdosing. The new year was filled with a sense of sadness, with only the father seemingly continuing with everyday life. He incessantly recited family maxims and asked everyone to share their New Year's resolutions, a tradition Ellen used to enjoy, but this year only brought her infinite weariness.
Lost my desk at the magazine. Really fucked up the Sullivan interview, so I'm not gonna get that job back.
Seemingly influenced by Ellen's sincerity, her younger brother also stood up and confessed about having to repeat a grade. "I failed my English class last semester," he admitted. With a stern face, the father walked away to the side as the television broadcasted the joyous New Year celebrations. The mother noticed the tension between her daughter and husband and asked Ellen what had happened between them. Ellen evaded the question, unwilling to reveal the cruel truth to her mother. However, her mother, with red eyes, told her, "There's nothing about your father that I don't know." When you've been married for a long time, you start to compromise. It's something you would never think of doing when you were young. On some nights, you swear you can't take another minute, but when you wake up in the morning, the scent of coffee wafting through the kitchen and the children fixing their own hair, you look at your husband and know he's not who you thought he was, but you can't leave him. Ellen couldn't believe her mother had known all along but had chosen endless compromise and tolerance. Her mother was a born decorator, effortlessly turning all the fragments into beautiful artworks. Yet, the price of that perfection was her entire life. Following her mother's instructions, Ellen went to a pub to find her father, who nostalgically recalled the early days of his and her mother's relationship. After over 20 years of marriage, claims of lacking feelings were false, but he had grown accustomed to being the dignified one who was taken care of in the relationship. Thus, when the mother needed him the most, he chose to escape. Seeing his weak and cowardly demeanor, Ellen couldn't bring herself to scold him, only informing him that their mother was waiting at home for them. In the days to come, the father started returning home earlier each time, yet the mother's condition deteriorated rapidly. Her hair turned white and sparse, and the illness plagued her, causing a drastic decline in her appearance. Sometimes she would cry and ask Ellen to help her find release.
I can't. Just be over, baby. Please help me. You help me. You're my girl. You help me, please. Haley, promise me you help me.
Ellen poured out half a bottle of pills, crushed them with a spoon, and thought about adding them to her mother's porridge. However, at the last moment, she couldn't bring herself to do it. Ellen's greatest regret was that she had never truly understood her mother until the last 2 months of her life. It was then that she realized her mother's precious innocence and wisdom hidden beneath mediocrity. She also understood why her mother seemed dim, as she had devoted her entire life to her children and husband. Despite Ellen's deep reluctance, her mother passed away on a snowy night. Before her death, Ellen seemed to intuitively walk to her mother's side, where her mother's eyes were vacant, breathing laboriously and heavily.
Love you, Ellie.
I love you.
I knew that. I always knew that.
At her mother's funeral, her ex-boyfriend, who was seeking reconciliation, hugged Ellen. But having experienced ups and downs, Ellen now knew exactly what her heart desired and needed. Her mother's departure made her stronger. Ellen understood that once someone compromises their values, there will be endless regressions. She directly refused him. While tidying up the house one night, Ellen found an empty pill bottle in the trash and her gaze fixed on her father's face in a photo on the fridge. He knew her mother had asked him the same thing. The next day, as Ellen planted flowers around her mother's grave, her father praised her courage, wishing it had been him who did it.
Dad, I didn't do it. I didn't do it.
To their surprise, they realized that her mother had completed the act on her own, even at the end of her life. The movie One True Thing is a lament for women. Only when daughters stand in their mother's shoes can they understand their grievances and forgiveness. Fathers, who are the pillars of the family, are depicted as both weak and cruel, praising their wife's perfection and omnipotence while refusing to acknowledge their dependency on her endless sacrifices. Although the mother in the movie accepts these unlimited sacrifices wholeheartedly, do you agree with her actions? Share your thoughts in the comments section.